Hello everybody, welcome to a new session on the impact and outcomes of built environment education. And we're looking especially at the moments and processes of built environment education for children and young people. And we're doing this today together, and I'm very happy to welcome my colleague, Thomas Coelen.
Hello.
Thomas, you want to introduce yourself? What is your background?
My background, I'm an educational scientist, as you may say, of the University of Siegen, which belongs to the province of North Rhine-Westphalia, about 500 kilometers south of Berlin. And I am interested in research on children and young people, especially related to spatial concerns, spatial themes. Their knowledge about spaces, their movings and activities in spaces and so on. And I'm very glad to have a lot of projects together with Angela and to introduce you to this project we made together some years ago.
And first of all, of course, if we talk about educational outcomes of BE projects, it's important to define what is a learning process, in what settings does learning happen?
Exactly. And I would like to introduce you to a scheme of thinking what learning might be. I'm sure you have already known about the difference between so-called formal learning and informal learning. Some people do say non-formal learning. Formal learning and informal learning you can separate theoretically, of course. In practice, all these things are mingled together and work together, but theoretically you can separate more or less formal processes of learning from informal process of learning. Formal process of learning, or you may say with an emphasis on formal processes, is, for example, a curriculum-based learning at school. That's the example everybody would easily know. An informal learning, to make an example from the other side, is the way of learning you do when you are not intended to learn something, but you learn something. So by walking through a city, by scrolling around in the internet, by talking to each other, by sitting around and watching things and so on. That's informal learning. And of course, these things are, as I said before, are mixed together in practice, but theoretically you can divide between these two ways of processes in the individual. But this is more or less easy, but things get complicated when you also separate the two types of settings, more or less formal settings or more or less non-formal settings. A formal setting, as I refer to the example I made before, is people sit together in rows in a classroom and the teacher is standing in front and telling what is going on. That is a very formal, ritualized, time-fixed schedule, curriculum-based schedule, and everybody knows more or less what to do. And on the other hand, you have non-formal settings. For example, sitting at the kitchen table at home and maybe do some homework, but talking to your mother or father, cooking lunch or dinner or everything like this, and scrolling around the internet, but at a very informal setting where things like learning might happen and might happen some other things. So as you can divide between formal and non-formal processes within the individual, you can divide between formal settings, which are really intended and formed for supporting learning processes, and more or less non-formal settings where nobody really would see from outside that this is intended to support learning processes. So we have processes in the individual and settings in the environment. And this is a theoretical frame where you can also put in these examples which are related to built environment learning. Of course, you could have an architectural class, a course at school, for example, in art history or something similar to that. But you can also have a very non-formal setting without any intention of learning by scrolling around with a friend through a park. And so there are many more examples, as you might know. You can put them in this scheme of processes and settings to make a first way of ordering what is going on in this field.
Exactly, thank you very much. And it somehow also was the starting point of our research, because we were wondering, how do children learn or young people learn within these very different settings? What is their own opinion about it? And also what value does it give to their everyday life? I think this basically were also the starting research question of our research project. And there is a big publication out, a thick book. I show it here. And I can show it because it is available open access to you. And basically, we will shed light and highlight some outcomes of some findings out of this research project. And it started also by looking at 6 different cases, basically, which were all programs and institutions offered by different stakeholders to young people to learn about the built environment, to learn about the city and architecture. Looking at these 6 cases, they can be basically clustered in 3 fields. First of all, it is about a major characteristic that was put forward by the young people is the aspect of doing it yourself and designing yourself. So the atmosphere of learning was very much conducive to this. And here the participants, clearly the young people, act as stakeholders. So they have a very active learning part in it, not just recipients of some theoretical concepts or abstract knowledge. It's about doing it and experience admit it. And just to quote one, I wrote it here, but you find these quotes also throughout the book, is, "I simply enjoy the fact that I can work with my own hands," was one quote somebody gave us. And very important are the mentionings of the young people when it comes to tools and materials. It was very clearly that in a lot of statements they would refer to the different tools they would use and also to the materials they would use in these architectural educational programs and offerings, and how they and the use of it also basically strengthened their self-confidence. And I also want to share one more quote here of a young person who said, "I definitely love the process of working with my hands and designing something. And yesterday, I think I sat there working on the stairs of my model for 2-3 hours with a cutter. And of course, it's strenuous and hard to some extent, but somehow it's also a great deal of fun to do it." And of course, they, in such a practice, they acquire a number of skills, knowledge about materials and different types of tools, of course. But also we could find several statements that being part of such activities is indeed altering the perception of the environment, the judgment of the environment. And they realize that they can, in a lot of these activities, implement their own ideas. They can be creative. They can be, they said they are creators, and sometimes they feel a little bit like artists, and they are meeting in these activities and rules, yes, but there seem to be less rules. They are more independent and can experience also through this independence some kind of self-efficacy that enables and fosters again their personal feelings. And this was stressed very much. And this brings me also to the second point. What is also important and helpful, at least the students pointed out that and they often compare in their interviews to school routines. They would say, compared to school, the learning I'm experiencing in the built environment educational setting is special. It is more relaxed, more laid back. People seem to be happier, they would say. And of course, it could be due to the fact that a lot of these activities are indeed more participatory, more voluntary, so they can choose themselves to be part of or not. Of course, if it's part of school, then but even like to be part in the architecture semester in school is a free choice. They could have also chosen another thing. So there is somewhat more choosing, more volunteering, deciding for yourself to be part of such activity or not. And they also experience that so as a social setting because there's a lot of group work that also comes with challenges. Some young people that talked to us said that it is also hard at times to work in groups, but it is especially the social setting we think that is promoting the learning processes. And this brings me to the last point of what characterizes basically this learning in built environment education from the perspective of children and young people. Again, keep in mind we talk to them, asking them how they characterize the type of learning and the skill acquisition they are experiencing. And they would say that especially the educators, the BE educators, the people that teach built environment education play a crucial role. They are seen as experts, as very authentic experts that know about planning and architecture and construction and design. And they are experienced as supportive, as approachable. And sometimes they also would say it's a mishmash between friends and teachers. So here again, we would sometimes find a comparison to teachers. But these 3 points of doing it yourself, doing it, being creative as a one point, then built environment education as a social setting, and the educators as a resource and experts, I think, are 2 major characteristics that help learning within BE. Nevertheless, a second and very important part of our research was also to look beyond, to ask the young people we were talking to first, yes, how they experienced the BE offerings, programs and institutions, but then we asked them, where before in your life, outside of this very specific offering of BE education, where do you learn about the built environment? And we've found some very interesting, or we got some very interesting responses here that opened up a whole, or a lot more dimension where built environment education happens. This is the part, Thomas,
that's right,
you can take over.
Yeah, of course, that's right. And what struck us a lot was the big emphasis kids and young people put in the interviews on the learning spot of family. All of the kids, all of the young people emphasized the role of the family as a learning spot, a learning institution, as you may say. not only related to built environment education, but in general, of course. But focused on built environment education, the kids were telling stories about watching construction sites with their parents, watching their own construction activities of father, mother, uncle, aunt, and so on, watching and telling stories about constructing with some materials, with at the kitchen table and so on. So family was a main topic of all the interviews, which we didn't expect into that extent. And the second institution, as you may say, which young people were talking about, of course, this was not surprising, was the leisure time and the friends, the peers, of course. We did expect that, we did expect it to that extent, and we did expect it into that variety. Of course, this is also related to media, that kids were telling a lot of stories about games. Angela will tell a little later about it, games in the internet which are related to constructing and so on. But also moving around with the peers in parks and on the streets is by the perception of the young people themselves a way of learning how environment is built by adults and how you can use it in different ways as are things obviously meant to be used. This is what, especially in the youth age, as you all know, is emphasized a lot of young people, that you use a bus stop not as a bus stop, but as a meeting point, as a party spot, as whatever. And this is one example out of a lot of examples you might know, where built environment is perceived by young people, but you say in German, is umgenutzt, used in different ways as it is meant to be used. This is a specific activity at youth age. In general, but also related to built environment learning processes. And then we have the classical institutions, kindergarten and school. And the young people we interviewed, of course, told a lot of stories about activities which are related to built environment learning processes in kindergarten and school. This was not surprising, but I repeat it again, the big role of family learning-based processes surprised us a lot, and this was not pushed by us in the interviews. It came from themselves. They were telling these stories, and also telling stories about family visiting spots where they where other things were intended, but they learned something about the built environment. Yeah, these are the things. These are the three institutions which are interested, which was my main interest in the outcomes of the interviews. Yeah.
And I think we can add to this also that, of course, we could see differences in, especially class and income, in a sense of when it comes to traveling. So we did have a number of young people and children that reported like going on vacation, going sometimes abroad, and really different cultures, and seeing that architecture and the ways of building constructions are different there. They could tell us sometimes in quite detail what they were seeing there and what they experienced there. But we also noticed that especially the children we interviewed that have not maybe don't go on vacation like abroad, traveling much, they would not tell us many stories of that kind. So you could see a little bit difference of that, or? And another thing, yes, that I wanted to add, because it is something I think we tend to forget, this virtual world of learning about built environment education, the digital media, and as a learning environment. And here we were surprised about the diverse, dynamic, and exciting learning moments, I would say, from at least from the perspective of young people, and especially the older kids that would report about these learning moments that we could get out of the interviews. And of course, Minecraft is one example that goes across all age groups, that we heard young people talking about it, children talking about it, and also as a social activity, meaning it's not much only them playing Minecraft and building, of course, future cities and environments, but also with their sibling, teaching their siblings or teaching their cousins about it. What was also interesting, sometimes even playing with grandma, for example, with Minecraft, like games like this. What was interesting to us is they also compared it to, for example, some of the activities. There have been experiences here where they always have the limits of material, the limits of you can construct with, basically. And in Minecraft, you don't experience these limits. You have resources, endless resources, and they also say, like, even money-wise, in my whole in my own, like when we build our house or when I redecorate my room, I have limits in money how I do this. But in Minecraft, in the digital world, I don't have these limits. So they compare it also to some of the activities and their everyday life. I think that was very interesting. And it also, and this was one focus, of course, we wanted to find out how they make use of the knowledge they acquire. And they would say, for example, in Minecraft, I would test the size of the veranda we plan to build. I also would test the size of the room for my grandma because she wanted to buy a new sofa. So it's stories like that they could show how they basically use the knowledge they gain here, self-taught. It's a lot of self-learning that's going on. It's not part of formal education. It's also not part of a lot of our BE activities yet, I would say. But how they make use of it already in their everyday life, I think that was very interesting to us to see. But in the end, we also have to say that these activities online refer to BE learning context. By the way, they also noted, said or mentioned games like SimCity or even Counter-Strike, which was surprising to me, or Anno. So they used all kinds of games they were citing where they could see that it has something to do with planning, design, and construction. But, and I think this is the statement I wanted to do originally, is they see it forefront as gaming activities. And then, and this is how a lot of informal learning happens, it's not seen as learning.
What outcomes or what conclusions do we take out of our research for the practice of built environment education? And I would like to start with one topic which struck me very much, is the big variety of different settings related to built environment education.
Do you mean institutionalized, or do you mean also beyond institutions, so free time?
Both of them. Before we were starting with the interviews, of course, you remember we made we made a system of what we expect to be important to research about, and we made this system of institutions and so on. Of course, we did know that learning is not only based in institutions, informal institutions, but the biggest variety we couldn't expect before. So when we were talking to the young people, we were reaching to them, we were addressing to them in one course, for example, one thing. But when we were talking about their biographical experiences on built environment education, a big variety of learning spots came to their mind and to our mind. And this is something which struck me, that the biggest variety is something which I think is very rich and which should be supported the variety.
So this would mean basically that it's important to acknowledge that you have these different settings where built environment education happens, even informally, with friends, with family. And when we talk about policies fostering built environment education, that of course it would be important to have this different varieties also in mind. So not only focus, for example, which is done very often on schools, like bringing built environment education into schools, that it is also important to really have the, we would say, educational landscape, the whole educational landscape and the diverse settings where built environment education happens in mind, to maybe also, and I think this is a research gap, but also needed when you design policies, is to have the picture, where do we have already institutions, NGOs, museums, what type are active in which settings, and where are the blind spots. I think this is not done systematically right now. To have, like, to map out this landscape of architecture education, built environment education, and finding out where is basically, where are the gaps, where are the blind spots. And I think what we also not do, and I think this is also important, is that on the other hand, take into mind or to take more into consideration what knowledge young people acquire already with their families, with their friends. I think I don't remember preparing BE workshop asking my students or my children beforehand, or finding out what do they know already, what can I build upon. So I think this is also something that comes out of our research very much, that we have to pay more attention than before on what knowledge is already there we can build upon. And so this is, I think, another thing that is a hint for practice.
Yeah, I agree, and I would like to come back to the part of school. Of course, it would be very good to strengthen BE as a part of school, of course. But I agree with what you were saying, that to formalize built environment education as a school curriculum would have a counter effect, because as much as things get formalized, so much they are not of that biggest interest of young people in their leisure time. So we should we should strengthen built environment education as part of school, but also using the entire urban environment as a learning space. So that in school educational terms, it would be emphasis outreach, using out-of-school learning spots systematically, not only as folklore or something like this, but systematically to build up this variety of learning spots. This is very important, I would say.
Yes, and I think also for reasons of inequality, it's important to bring it in the school curriculum, but carefully. I think that's the message. Don't over-formalize it. It comes with gains and it comes with loss, and to have it in school. And I think this is also a lot of these messages we got from students and from the young people themselves, that they appreciate it, but they also at times have trouble dealing with the fact of grading, for example, like having their work, having their creative work being graded upon and judged upon by grades. I think this is a struggle they also feel. I remember them talking to us about it. Another thing is, and I think this is important and also was mentioned by us before, is this uniqueness of materials and tools that are used within built environment education. And I think it became clear that this hands-on, this sensory part of built environment education, when it comes to materials and tools, but I think also what you said before about spaces, not talking about spaces, but going there, experience them bodily, not in theory talk about architecture styles, but go there and talk about in front of a building that is built, for example, in style of brutalism, has a different effect, a learning effect for the children and young people. And it is, of course, important to keep that strength of working with materials, working with tools, going to places and spaces. I think this is the uniqueness. And it opens up doors for a lot of young people to get knowledge about architecture and built environment. But on the other hand, we also experience, well, we did not see it in our data, the gender differences. I think it's nothing for front that jumped at us when we looked at the data, also age-wise, for example, when it comes to certain tools that maybe rather girls than boys use them, or rather young people than older people use them. But from practice myself, I have to stress that I did experience moments where girls were not allowed to use certain tools by their parents, while their much younger sibling, a boy, was allowed to do so. So it is something I would say keep an eye on in your practice when you do these, that you sometimes have to democratize tools to make them available, and maybe sometimes have to also motivate young people to use certain tools. And last but not least, I think the digital world, I think I talked about that in the session before. I think it's important for us as educators to embrace that world, to somehow try to understand the digital world and see what's out there when it comes to content, but also to tools that we could partner up in our methods with and work with it. I think there still is a lot to be done in that field, for sure. But I think also the past years with the pandemic situation, a lot of teaching has moved online. I think we gained some experience in it, that it's now time to lean back, ask yourself what worked well, what's worth keeping, and what maybe also did not work. And we're happy to go back to work with real materials and tools in architecture education.
Yeah, and I would like to conclude with John Dewey. Some 100 years ago, he said learning by doing is the most important way of learning. And in built environment education, there comes another thing into that game, also emphasized by John Dewey, is that by doing things, you are participating. And when you are active in constructing some built environment in minor dimensions or in bigger dimensions, you are not only learning, but you're also participating. You are also part of a democratic process. This is something John Dewey in 1916 already emphasized, and which is still important for educational thinking. And in built environment education, these things come all together: learning, participating, democratic participation on that.
And to maybe not conclude only with John Dewey's work, but maybe also with a comment of one young people. And I think I'm not like giving it or repeating it one-to-one. I think it stayed a little different, but basically one young woman we interviewed, one teenager, she said, why should I learn about all these things about architecture and planning and design if none of the adults actually let us participate in the creation of the built environment? So I think this is a statement that also got me thinking again of the importance to combine built environment education, architecture education with real participation of young people shaping the environment.